Good morning. How's everybody this morning?
Fine. How are you?
Good, right? I think we're almost done with contracts. Is anybody excited as I am?
Mm-hmm.
We have done 9 sessions on the contracts. Do you think they're important?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're pretty important. It's pretty important to get them right? All right, so we're going to pick up on our exhibits again. We are picking up with sale or lease a buyer's property contingency. Make sure we're covered. So let's go through it. What is the purpose of this contingency? When do you use it? Come on, guys. I know it's early, but
When the buyer already has a property that they need to sell.
there you go. When the buyer has a property they need to sell. And so why wouldn't you just write a special stipulation that says contract is contingent on buyer selling their house? Because that happens all the time. So why wouldn't you do that?
Because they don't want to sell it. They want to lease it.
Well,
They want the option-
okay,
they
so
want the
they
option
want to
to
lease it,
lease
you could write that. But why do we need, I mean, this is a whole page of language, right, that some lawyer wrote up. And so why do we need all this language? Can't we just say, you know, the sale's contingent on the buyer's property selling?
It's a horrible special stipulation.
That is a horrible special stipulation, for one. But if you're the listing agent and you represent the seller, and the stipulation says contract is contingent on the buyers being able to sell their property, even if you put a date, where's the balance of risk? Who's taking the most risk on there? The buyer or the seller? The seller, right? Because that stip is kind of all powerful. It has no limits, no like language backing it up as to what they need to be doing. It doesn't even tell you what the property is. You know, I mean, so basically it's a get out of jail free card that they can come forward and say, okay, we didn't sell our house, we're out, we want our earnest money back. Wait, what? That's not good, right? That's not a fair contract, at least in our terms. So if you are the listing agent and you get a contract that has a stipulation in it like that, then you counter with the exhibit. Okay? And so the exhibit says the buyer warrants that buyer owns the real property located at, and gives the address of the property, and has taken or is taking the following actions to sell and or lease the other property. And then there's just a blank line. So if you're the buyer's agent, what do you put there? This is going to be a slow morning if you guys can't make the phone. Everybody did nobody eat their Wheaties this morning.
What was the question?
Wowza. What actions can the buyer take to sell or lease their property?
List it with an agent.
List it with an agent. There's a good start. In today's market and economy, if I've got a hot listing that I need to sell, would I, as a seller, take a contingency to sell or lease a property? Depends. And you know what it depends on? It depends on what's written in that blank right there about what they're doing to sell the property. Because if their property is already under contract and through due diligence, well, now I might take it because that level of risk for a seller is not very high. They've already gotten it under contract. It's already been through due diligence. So minimal risk, right?
It'll probably sell.
Whereas I'm going to list it in a week and a half when I get it ready, that might not be. Or I'm going to list it within 24 hours of this contract going binding. Well, for what? How much? Because as a listing agent, if we're balancing risk, we need to make sure that when they list that property, they're not listing it at 20% over market, right?
Been on the market 90 days.
Or, yeah, if it is listed already, how long has it been listed? How's it priced? It's our job to now go in and look at that property and evaluate and be able to give the seller advice and say, their property's on the market. It's been on the market for X number of days, and according to my market analysis, it's close, way off, reasonably underpriced, overpriced, whatever, right? Because the seller needs information to be able to make a decision on what they're going to do, okay? The paragraph B says the agreement is contingent upon the occurrence of the following on or before such and such a date. Either check 1, buyer closing on the sale of the other property, or 2, buyer entering into a lease on the other property with lease term of at least blank. So at that point, it's at least a year, 6 months, 2 years, whatever. You can check both of those boxes if you're trying to sell or lease the property. So that's okay. And the date that you put there, what date should that be? Say your closing is supposed to be on December 31st. What do you put for the date on the buyer's contingency? Do you want it to be the same as the closing date?
January
10,
1st.
15, 20.
You'd prefer it to be earlier than. 10 years ago, we would have always made it the same day because we would have done back-to-back closings in a heartbeat. In today's environment, back-to-back closings are somewhat heart palpitations because, come on, it's gonna hold together, you know, because if the dominoes start to fall, everything starts to come down. So it's important to give yourself at least a couple of days, a few days. I personally like to give myself at least 7 days, 8. You know why? Because if they're under contract, what exists in their contract that can push the closing back? Remember back to when we went through the main body of the contract, there's a paragraph,
Right to extend
unilateral
right to
extension of the
extend.
contract, 7 days, right? So if we know that there are other people might be able to push it back 7 days, and we make sure that they close that much earlier. Now, what does that cause problems with? If I sell my house and I'm not closing on this one until 7 days later, where do I live?
Yeah, they don't want to do that.
So that doesn't always work. I mean, there are issues that you have to take into consideration with that. And so typically, you're looking at best bet is probably a day or 2. Okay, but it's a balance of risk. It's a balance of who's got to do what. You know, if they're moving from Chicago to Atlanta and that property that they're selling is in Chicago, 7 days might be fine. Because by the time the truck gets down here and, you know, I mean, they could keep the house for a couple of days up there, get it all packed up, send it on the truck, come down, and ultimately they're going to be in a hotel anyway for a day or 2. It's probably not as big of a deal. But if they're moving from Sandy Springs to Dunwoody, upgrading, then,
Yeah.
then they might not want to do that, right? Because the move time is like a day. So you got to take that into consideration, okay? Which is why it's important to talk to the other side. It's important to have a conversation with the agent on the other side to know as much as you can know about what's going on. Because that allows you to convey that information to your client and be able to make educated conversations and decisions, right? All right. Any questions so far on this one?
I got one for you. If you're talking about an interstate move and there's a contract that's pending in the other state, would it be better for us to have our counsel review that contract to understand what the terms and conditions are there in setting that date? Because if there's a different kind of a kickback
And very
period-
true, because the unilateral, if there is one, could be 14 days in Chicago for all I know. I don't know. I don't sell real estate in Chicago. So yes, you could potentially want to review and or discuss with the listing agent in Chicago the situation, because no matter what, a lot of times if it's local, the agent that's bringing you the buyer is the agent that's selling their house too. A lot of times, not always, but a lot of times. that makes it easier because then you can have those conversations with them and they kind of know everything that's going on, right? If the agent, for some reason, that's selling their house is not the agent bringing them to your listing, then you need to reach out to that other agent and figure out what's going on. And that's true whether it's in Chicago or Atlanta. Because you want to know what exactly is the situation. How strong do you feel about the contract? Ask the questions, dig deep. They may not answer all of them, but you want to ask them to try and get a feel for how strong is this really? Because it may be, you know, if you found out, hey, it's a cash buyer, we're outside, there are no contingencies, they've got, you know, $500,000 down already in escrow, it's just a matter of 14 days before they close. Oh, well, that's different than, well, we just put it on the market and we're, you know, I mean, there's a lot to that. Okay? All right, so then C is buyer agrees to use the buyer's best efforts. Now, this is a very important paragraph to understand because most agents really overlook this. Buyer agrees to use buyer's best efforts to fulfill the contingency or contingencies referenced above prior to the expiration of the contingency period. In the event that the contingency period ends without any contingency referenced above being fulfilled, this agreement shall terminate. The contingency or contingencies referenced above may be waived by the buyer on notice to the seller, provided that such notice is given prior to the end of the contingency period. That's like 4 sentences, and there's a ridiculous amount of information in there. Okay, so let's go through it. Buyer agrees to use their best effort. So, if the property is listed and it's not under contract yet, and you find out that it's appointment only, and every time somebody calls to get an appointment, they say, oh, no, it's not available to show right now.
That's not best.
Is that their best effort?
No.
Nope. So you call them on it. Okay? We've seen situations where it's close to the end of the contingency period. They had a contract, it fell apart, and the buyer basically said, you know, there's no way I'm going to sell my house. And they pretty much stopped trying to sell their house. They're now in violation of this contingency because they're not putting their best effort into selling their house. Now, if it's a week before the end of the contingency, the chances of getting it under contract and closed probably pretty slim, and I would tend to agree. But jumping ahead a few sentences, do they have the right to terminate the contract based on it being a week before the end of the contingency and they haven't sold their house yet? No, they do not.
Special stipulation.
You would have to write a special stipulation to allow them to do that.
Then you have to define best efforts,
And, well, best efforts, yes, you could define best efforts, all right, lawyer.
and you can't.
But if you were to take that week before the end of contingency and everybody knows, buyer, seller, everybody knows that this contract, there's no way they're going to sell their house, you know, in the next week. We all agree we want to kill the contract. Do we do a termination and release? Unilateral? Anybody? Buyer or seller? Does anybody have the right to terminate the contract unilaterally?
And so both have to.
You have to do a mutual termination.
Because there is a waiver by the buyer embedded in this contract.
There's a waiver, but only a waiver of the contingency. So as
Right.
soon as you waive the contingency, then you have no right to terminate the contract.
But you have
But
to
the
give them that
seller-
opportunity first to waive.
Correct. Because the reality is, if they get to the date and they haven't sold their property or leased it, depending on what you check, now the contract terminates. But a week before that, when everybody knows we're toast, this is not going to work, we can't kill it unless we do a mutual termination. So be very careful, because if a buyer sends a termination notice, that's not really them probably using their best efforts to sell their house, right? If a seller sends a termination notice, is that in violation of the contract? Do they have any right to terminate? No. even though everybody knows. So that's why it's got to be mutual, okay? And that's an important one with this contingency. Most people think of this contingency like a due diligence. The date is so far out. Anytime between now and then, if I can't sell my house, I can just kill it. No. Only if you haven't sold it at this point in time. Not before, but this point in time. Okay? All right.
Can I ask a question? So I'm trying to figure out when that would be beneficial for the seller. Because if you have the house under contract, okay, yes, it's not going to close by the date that's on the contract. But if that house is under contract, they're going to have to start over.
Right.
So the only time that would really be beneficial is if they have somebody there that has a cash offer, you know, that's come in and
Well,
said, look.
And most of the time, it's when the buyer's house is no longer under contract or is not under contract, and
Okay.
it's a week out. That's
Right,
when everybody
right,
says, okay,
okay.
we're going to have to try this. Either, yes, the seller may decide, okay, you know what? I'll stick with this buyer. Let's give them some more time. And if the buyer agrees with that, then you can amend that. Or, you know what? I'm going to just try again. And we go back out into the open market and try for another offer.
Okay.
Okay. So the next thing is D, is the kick out provision. If you're the listing agent, do you want a kick out provision? Yes. If you're the buyer's agent, do you want a kick out provision? No, because it's a balance of risk. Now, the balance of risk in this paragraph is extremely weighted towards the seller, positively towards the seller, sorry. Because the kick out basically says, well, okay, we have you under contract on this house. Carmen, you're going to buy this house, but I know you've got to sell yours first. So we'll give you until the day before closing to sell your house, and we'll go with that. But we're going to do a kick out. Now, the way the kick out's written, let's say I'm going to have 72 hours. Be generous, because that's pretty generous.
3 days.
Most of the time, it's like 48 or 24. Okay? But we're going to say, all right, well, Pat came along, and she now wants to buy my house. And she's got an offer, and we are under contract as a backup offer. I'm going to come to you, Carmen. I'm going to say, guess what? You got 72 hours. You can give me an additional $10,000 in earnest money and remove all contingencies.
Oh, wow.
Did you get that? Remove all contingencies, not just the sale or lease purchase. We're only 1 day under contract. You've got a 10-day due diligence, but guess what? It's about to go away. And so is your finance contingency and appraisal and everything else gone. So you've just given me another 10 grand and you're buying this house as it sits. And I'm not doing anything else. Does that work for you?
No.
Well, you know.
You can have it.
Yes, Pat. Okay, Pat, let's work on that. It all depends on timing, right? I mean, yes, if you get another offer that comes in back up and you institute the kick out, 24 hours after you just went binding, you might have trouble with that because they haven't done anything, right? There's been no inspections, there's been no anything. If you happen to be beyond due diligence and you're just in financing, but they've already, Carmen's been down the path with her finance, everything seems fine, there shouldn't be any issues, nobody's worried about the appraisal, then probably we could be okay with that, assuming that she can actually close on this house without the other one closing. Because if she can't buy this house without selling hers first, she's never going to agree to do the kick-out. Most of the time, buyers enter into these sale or lease of buyer's property contingencies with a kick-out with their fingers crossed, hoping that another offer doesn't come along. Now, as buyer's agents, when you're out there showing property, do you show property that's listed as contingency kick-out?
Yeah. You could make a good offer.
You have a
Why
fiduciary
not?
duty to your client to ensure that they get the best buyer for the best money.
You do. But as a buyer's agent, when you're searching in the system, does anybody just flick it to active? And I'm just looking for active properties? You're not pulling the ones that have contingencies? It defaults to active and contingency, kick out, and one other contingency. I don't remember what the other one is.
Maybe you're about to ask or talk about this, but are you allowed to write in the contract that the listing will stay active in the system while the
You
contract
are,
is still?
absolutely.
Okay, gotcha.
But technically, FMLS has a status that is considered active, but it indicates to everyone that there is a kick-out contract in place. So, if you are showing buyers, you should be looking at contingency kickouts. Because worst thing that can happen is that you go after the house, and they're so far down the path that the buyer now does the contingency. But chances of that, pretty slim. Because they wouldn't have put the contingency on there to sell their house if they could have bought this house without it, most likely. They do sometimes, but most of the time, the reason for this contingency is because I need to sell my house before I can buy this one. So if you come along with a strong enough offer that the seller wants to accept, they now can initiate, there we go, not instigate, initiate the kick-out clause and go from there. And you have a relatively high probability of getting a house. So don't take those off your list. All right? Any other questions about this? All right, cool. On to the next one. The next one, speaking of backup agreement contingencies, is the backup agreement contingency, which kind of goes hand in hand with the sale of lease buyer property. Because in order to kick it out, we got to have a backup agreement. Okay? This backup agreement is pretty straightforward. There are only a few blanks in it. We have the offer date of the contract that I'm writing. I represent a buyer. Let's set up a scenario. I represent a buyer coming in to put an offer on Taylor's listing that he already has under contract with Mario. Okay? Are you with me?
Mm-hmm.
So I put in my offer date here at the top, and I have the address of the property that we're going under, that's Taylor's listing. And then under paragraph number 1, where it says primary agreement dated, I need to put the date of Mario's contract. Now, how am I going to know that?
Ask.
Ask, right? This whole communication thing with the other side. It's important. So I'm going to call Taylor. I'm going to go, Taylor, I'm putting in my offer. Obviously, you need a backup contingency. Can I get the date and the name? Because the next one down is primary buyer. I need Mario's name, or Mario's client's name, Mario's the agent. Because I've got to have something. Now, why do I need that? What's the purpose of that being in that paragraph?
To identify the specific contract.
Because I've got to identify that exact contract. Because what happens if Taylor says, all right, Mario's contract fell apart, but I got Rob over here. He's getting an offer in too, and he's cut this, or whatever.
You're next in line.
But I was
to do
next
that.
in line.
Right.
Oh well. No. Yeah, this is the primary contract. Sorry, Brett, you're out. So we need to know who the buyer is.
Why would somebody, I was talking to another agent and this happened over the summer, and she said that her client did not want to accept backup offers. She had another person that wanted to put an offer on the table even though they were under contract. And they said, nope, we don't want to do any backup. Why would you do that?
I'm sure there are 1,000 reasons. I'm not thinking of too many off the top of my head at the moment. Because, I mean, there's no reason not to have a backup
That's what I
offer. And in today's market environment, where buyers, things happen and weird stuff happens, I don't think it hurts to have a backup offer. But if, for instance, the initial offer process was a multiple offer situation where it was basically a bidding war and they drove the price up, getting a backup offer by itself is one person negotiating with you, and there's no emotional trauma to it. So they may not want to do a backup because they may think, and this may be the agent or the seller, they may think that, well, if this contract falls apart, I want to put it back out and create the bidding war again to drive the price up.
And this was actually, it was two people that had bid on the same house.
Mm-hmm.
And the the owner, the seller chose the one they were gonna accept. And then after they've been in contract for 3 or 4 days, that agent came back from the other offer and said, we'd like to submit a backup offer. And that's when the conversation happened and the seller said no. I just thought it was very odd.
I mean, it's their choice.
Yeah,
You have to present all offers, but it doesn't mean they have to accept them.
yeah.
So, I mean, the best thing to do as the buyer's agent at that point is to write up the offer with the backup contingency
Mhm.
and send it in.
Okay.
Because the seller might change their mind if they're looking at it.
Okay.
So what do you do if you don't have the information?
Well, what you could do is you could leave it blank and put a stipulation that the listing agent will complete the information in paragraph 1 of buyer backup contingency. Because obviously if they don't want to accept backups, they're not going to tell you the information to be able to fill it out.
So is all the, because I did this once and just refreshed my memory. Is all the information regarding when the due diligence period starts is that in here?
Nope.
It's not. Where was that?
None of that is in here at all, and none of that's really relevant.
But for the backup offer, because I remember the other agent getting all worried, well, should I be getting my inspection now? And I'm like, no, yours doesn't start until your contract is actually active or whatever the
Right. So paragraph 5, which we're getting to, is kind of, I think, going to answer your question. And it addresses most of that. And it says, in the event the primary agreement is terminated, the seller shall deliver notice of the same to the buyer. This agreement shall become primary and no longer subject to this contingency, and buyer and seller shall close on this agreement in accordance with the terms and conditions provided. However, that, notwithstanding the contract, blah, 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 for the purposes under this agreement, the binding agreement date in the agreement shall be the date that the notice of the termination of the primary agreement is delivered by the seller to the buyer. Everybody get that?
Mm-hmm.
So here's the funny part. Technically, this contract has a binding date when it goes under contract, when it gets accepted by the seller as a backup.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens is, as soon as it becomes primary, that binding agreement date
Changes to that date.
from today to whatever date that delivery is done.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And then that kicks off all of your due diligence,
diligence,
financing, any other contingencies that are relevant to binding agreement.
So you do like a notice of new binding or notice of binding?
Yeah, they just have to do a delivery of any kind of notice. And then it says closing date shall be the date listed in the agreement unless, because of the change in the binding agreement date, any time periods of the buyer to conduct due diligence or fulfill other contingencies extend beyond the closing date, in which the new closing date shall be 7 days from the last date the buyer has to fulfill buyer contingencies or the end of any due diligence period, whichever is later. That's a big one too.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because so for instance, if, and the next paragraph gives us this date that this contract comes apart, but let's say that our contract was written to close December 31st, and we're a backup. We have a 14-day due diligence, and we're notified on the 21st that we become primary. What happens at closing date? Pushes back, right? Now, if we only have the due diligence, we don't have finance contingency, it's going to push back to the end of due diligence, right? But if we have a finance contingency in place that says 21 days, it's now going to push back to 7 days beyond that. So it's going to be 28 days from the day of notice.
Hmm.
This is basically going to be the end of January, so give or take.
Very short time frame.
So it's going to pull it together and it's going to make it quick. But what that does is it tries to allow for real world in that if we find out we become primary a week before we're supposed to close, there's just no way for us to pull that off,
Yeah,
right? I mean, that's not viable. So we need to have, and that's why that language pushes the contract close date back. Okay? And then the last paragraph says that if this agreement does not become primary by such and such a date, the agreement shall automatically terminate. In other words, if I say, I gotta close this by the end of the year or I'm gonna have to look for something else, I put the 31st. Now, what date would you want to put on that if you knew anything about the first contract?
I mean, anything like what?
If you knew, say for instance, when that first contract was supposed to close.
Oh, okay.
So what if that first contract was supposed to close on December 31st? Would we want to put December 31st on our sheet here?
No.
What might we want to put? Assuming that it's a Georgia contract that's primary, because that's who we're against, right?
Days perhaps.
We might want to do January 8th, right? So that we know that they will have time to close. The reality is that it's a balanced question. We go back to the question, what is the risk for your client? What does it mean to your client? It's not just best practice is put 21 days. Best practice is find out what your client's risk and situation in life is and see what happens if this happens or this happens. But in this case, we're taking into consideration what's happening in someone else's contract. And there's no reason for this contract to go much further than when they should close, because if they close,
It's a done deal.
this is done. Okay?
But what happens if you have no idea what the close date is going to be, because under this contingency, the buyer has no right to be advised of the terms of the primary
They
agreement.
don't, but you can ask.
To most,
And most people will tell you. Because it's not really, I mean, you're talking about trying to pin a contract on someone else's contract. It's a pretty basic piece of information to know. You're not asking for how much it was. You're not asking, you know, details that might affect your offer. You're asking, what time frame are we talking
Right,
about?
I'm just wondering how many people.
No,
play
for the most part.
hardball.
No, for the most part, they'll tell you. But again, if they don't tell you, then it's a question of, for your client,
Do they want to go forward?
when would they want this contract to go away? Now, here's the other reality. Let's talk real world. I put in a backup offer for the property that Taylor's got listed. The next day, we've got this all binding, it's all signed up, all good to go. The next day, my buyer says, hey, I like that house over there. Let's go after that. We go over, we get it under contract. Now under contract on 2 properties. Is that fun?
No.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. But what should we do once we get this other one under contract?
Terminate.
We need to terminate this one, right? Do we have the right to do that?
Sure.
Silence.
Yeah, you do.
And
the
therefore,
buyer?
absence of terms means it's not prohibited.
And so technically, we have a binding date, and I love having him in
I
there.
know, he's a.
Absence of terms. Anyway, technically, we have a binding date on the contract, but that binding date's going to change should we become primary. And I can't imagine there's anybody in the world that's going to argue that we aren't in some realm in due diligence where we have the right to terminate. Now, it's possible, and I'm not the attorney, but for the most part, agents are going to let you walk away because you were just a backup anyway.
Right.
Isn't that
They
what
already
number
under
6 says
contract.
though? That buyer can terminate at any time?
Yes,
So why is that a question?
but he also says they're going to give him $10.
Okay,
No, I'm just kidding. That's good. So yes, it does. The buyer can terminate anytime prior to receiving the notice.
Okay.
So you're good to
You
go.
can, yeah.
So when you have a backup, you need to remember that your buyer can still keep looking, because remember, if you threw in a backup and it didn't initiate a kickout clause, or it didn't initiate anything else that terminated the first contract, you're probably not going to get that house. Or if that house falls apart for inspection reasons, you might not still want it, right?
Right.
Because that's the other reality from that standpoint.
So okay, this is totally out of the ordinary, but so you're in the backup position of this first offer, and that one falls out, so now you become primary. Now that you know the name of the person who backed out, can you call that agent and say, hey, can I get your inspection?
You can, but the inspection doesn't belong to the agent, it belongs to the other
Belongs to the
buyer.
buyer.
It belongs to that other buyer.
Now, could you
So-
purchase that from that other buyer for a reduced cost? Possibly.
Why
Would you want to? No.
Tell you what,
If there's anything wrong with that inspection, you have no recourse against the inspector.
Right, because you have no contract with them.
But
But the other side of that is you might get that inspection for $50 versus $450.
and maybe they found something
And-
totally crazy with the house, which makes you automatically.
So
want this.
here's the other thing. Calling and asking questions is never an issue.
Mhm.
Answering them is the problem.
Mhm.
Okay. So if that agent, for instance, you called that agent and you said, hey, we just became primary because your contract fell out. Keisha, what happened? And Keisha goes on this long time, well, you know, we found this and this and this and this and all this, and the seller was just an idiot and he did this and this and this and this. Is that good or bad for Keisha?
Bad.
That's not good for her. It's good for us because now we know a bunch of stuff that we didn't know before, and we might be able to make a determination whether we want to bother having an inspection. But the reality is that the interpretation of inspections is also something, right? If we had 3 inspectors inspect the same property, we would get 3 different results. Not extremely different, hopefully, although it's possible because people are human, right? But in reality, the interpretation of, for instance, older property, the crack in the wall that's been there for 45 years, well, it's probably not an issue because it's the same size it was 45 years ago. It's just not going anywhere.
Settlement.
But an inspector that doesn't do anything but new construction and you know, newer homes, they come in, they see a crack in the wall, and oh my God, get an structural inspection because there's a big problem with the house is going to fall over. The house is 80 years old. It's probably not going to fall over now. It might have, but it's not now. Might. Could be wrong. Maybe somebody dug a tunnel under it. I don't know. You know, so, but these are the things that it's important to have, as Rob said, when you hire an inspector, your buyer has that contract with the inspector and can have some recourse there. Not much, but some. Whereas if you just get the inspection report from the other side, you know, you can read it for what it is, but it may not give you the interface that you really want.
But if there are problems, doesn't the seller then have a duty to disclose those problems? in
They
that?
do, yes.
So you should be getting it anyway from
They
the
should.
seller.
You should be able to ask the seller or listing agent, was there anything that came up that you need to do an updated disclosure? That's the kind of correct way to ask. Because then the listing agent is going to say, oh, no, nothing. Everything's fine. Well, I'm sorry, but they found water came in the basement and you didn't mark that on your disclosure. That's fraud on both their parts. And so we have seen lawsuits where people get sued because disclosure statements are not updated. So when you find, if you're a listing agent, sidebar, if you're a listing agent and you find that something happens to your listing that is materially relevant and should be on the disclosure, you need to send your
Update.
seller a new disclosure statement and say, hey, I know such and such just happened. We need to get a new disclosure statement. Okay? That's how you protect yourself and them. Because at the end of the day, the issue is not the issue. It's not disclosing the issue. That's the issue. Okay? All right. Moving on. Counteroffer to or modification of the unaccepted original offer. 2-pager. This is what we use if we get an offer that we don't like, right? We don't just take the offer and draw lines through the purchase price and write new numbers next to them. We use this form. Why?
A lot neater.
It's a lot easier to keep up with and cleaner. The other thing that's important about this contract, this form, is that it specifically points out that the previous counteroffers are rejected. So if I'm on counteroffer number 45, which you'll notice there's no such thing as a number up here. In Forms Pro, there's counteroffer 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They are all exactly the same and none of them have numbers on them. The only reason they're in there that way is so that you could keep a record of what you had gone through if you wanted to. Okay? All previous counteroffers are rejected. The effect of accepting this offer is that any terms in here that are different than the original contract are changed, and everything else in the original contract drops. Okay? Clean copy. Really dislike this paragraph. But this says that at any time prior to closing, either party, if so requested by the other, shall sign a conformed or clean copy of the agreement combining the terms of the original offer with the controlling and supplemental provisions of this counter into one document. So in other words, purchase price, whatever else was changed in here, you'd write an offer that had everything the way all the final terms were, and that'd be a clean copy. It's a complete and utter waste of your time and only an opportunity for error, in my opinion. Not that I have any, but it's truly, I mean, in today's day and age where you probably e-signed the first contract, and if you're using a counter form, the first contract should have been legible in the first place, so it shouldn't be an issue. It should be very easy. When you give a contract to somebody, you put the counter on top of it and the contract behind it, and that way everybody knows, hey, these are the terms that drive, and then the rest of things that weren't changed in this are in this rest of this contract. It's pretty simple. Okay? Terms and conditions. Now, the nice thing is they filled out in here, they've got the box basically from page 1 of the purchase and sale agreement, right? And so you can fill in. Now, what if you leave it blank?
They can put in whatever they want.
No.
If it's left
In
blank,
theory.
it's what the original offer is.
If it's left blank, then it reverts the original offer. Preferably, so that they can't write in whatever they want, you might put in A because that would be more appropriate. And then you only put in items where
The changes.
the changes are necessary. There are a lot of agents that, as a standard practice, fill out the whole block, whether it's changed or not. Why would you want to do that?
So your client doesn't call you up and ask why they're signing something that's
It has a blank.
blank.
Yeah.
That sounds like experience, but okay.
And you wanna make sure.
There's
everybody's-
numerous reasons. And, you know, from the person you're presenting the counter to, whether it's the buyer or the seller, because these can come from either, it is easier to be able to just look at all of kind of the main terms of the contract in one place instead of having to go, okay, so if the price was that, they changed, oh yeah, that changed.
Yeah.
You know, now you got kind of everything together. But again, be careful, because if you make a mistake and you think you're putting in $1,500 in closing and you actually write $15,000 and everybody signs it, oops. Right. Oops.
Unless you're the buyer, you're like, yeah.
I'm just saying. So those are the kinds of things that you got to pay attention to. The E section down here, the other modifications, is awfully small. So unless you're modifying like minimal stuff in the rest of the contract, you're probably going to need additional pages, which is why there's a checkbox there. Please make sure to check yes or no there are or are not additional pages attached. Because if you don't,
They're not gonna know to look for them.
and there are they a part of the contract?
No.
No. If you don't and there aren't, is there a hole in the contract? Yes. So please always check one or the other. There either are or there aren't. Pretty simple. Should be an easy question. Here's the other question. If I want to modify things, for instance, like the timeline in the finance contingency, how do I do that?
Including the time on new financing contingency.
One option is to include a new finance contingency. And in which case, I would say under the other modifications, that the attached exhibit F, whatever, replaces the original exhibit F in its entirety. And that way, whatever's in my new exhibit F goes with that. Now, here's the other thing to be careful of. If you're going back and forth counter to counter to counter, which counters count?
The only
Most recent.
The most recent.
Remember, this one rejected all previous ones. So it's only the counteroffer that gets signed and the original contract. So if in counter number 4, we attached a new finance contingency that we changed whatever, but we got counter number 5 back and it changed something else, but it didn't have the finance contingency attached to it. We accept counter 5. Which finance contingency are we going off of?
The original.
The original, right? Okay, so you gotta pay attention to that. The other thing is you can, instead of attaching a whole contingency, if you're changing one little thing, you could say, finance contingency paragraph, whatever, is hereby changed from 21 days to 14 days. I like to reference, just as a point of fact, when you're changing something, I like to reference what it was and what it will be. Because it just makes it easier to find, instead of saying the number of days listed in paragraph B, blah, 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 and write on and on. If I can just say, okay, in paragraph B, 21 days shall now be 14. Well, there's only one spot there that says 21 days. So now it says 14. Everybody should understand that. Okay? There's a time limit on this because it's an offer. And then there's a typical signature page. It's very similar to the regular contract, right? It is very important, as in the original contract, that all of the agent's information is in here. Remember the notification paragraph about emails being valid or not? Please make sure they're in there because that makes them valid. All right, so we do that. Any questions on counteroffer? Pretty straightforward. Use it, it's easy. Next one is the binding agreement date notification. This is a beautiful one-page form. Instead of having to send the entire contract with the binding date filled in, I can just fill out this one form and send it. Now, let's refresh. This is a big miss for a lot of people. When is the binding? Who does the binding?
One who wrote the offer.
When it receives the offer.
Yeah, the
So
last.
it's accepted.
All right, I heard two different things. Let's try it. So there's two options. There's the person that accepts the offer and the person that receives the accepted offer. Which one?
Person who
receives the
accepted
offer.
The receives accepted offer, right? Because there is no more an acceptance date. Binding is acknowledgement of receipt of acceptance.
But so often, I've only done 2
I
contracts.
know.
When they sign that offer.
They fill that puppy
they fill
right
it
in,
out.
right? Which is where this little form comes in awfully handy. Because if they sent you that contract with it signed, here, where's the, we've got our, they sent you the signature page, they've signed their side, and they fill in the binding agreement date, and it's like 11:30 at night. You can very nicely the next morning fill out this binding agreement date notification and put in today's date instead of yesterday's date, because yesterday was 11:30 at night.
And the buyer didn't see it.
The buyer didn't see it at 11:30 at night because he was sleeping. And you put in here that we received it today, and so binding is thereby today. And now your buyer has their day back. Okay, important. And if you send this form, it will trump that form.
I have a question. When we talked about earlier on about notifications, you had said that faxing is much better than emailing. So if they fax that acceptance of the contract, you're considered to have received it at time of fax. So that would be different than what you just explained.
But that will trump that.
That is true for notification, yes.
But not for the contract.
But remember, binding is when we acknowledge acceptance.
Okay,
So
so it's different.
it
Okay.
gets a little quirky. And in this day and age, you don't really have to worry too much about it because very few people actually fax things.
Okay.
But I would fax this. Okay. I would email and fax this. And I would do that with everything that was time sensitive, just so that we had that covered. Okay. And so, you know, basically it's pretty straightforward. You put in the information, you put in the acceptance, purchase was received by you at whatever time on such and such a date. In accordance, that's the binding agreement date, and you sign it, print your name, phone number, and then you put on here how you're sending it, email and fax. Okay? Questions about that one? Pretty straightforward. All right, next one is a fun form. It is the reminder of important dates in purchase and sale agreement. I often, when I send the binding agreement date notification, recommend you include the reminder of important dates with it. This is one that people don't use very much, but it's a great form. And the reason it's a great form is because if Taylor and I are involved in a transaction together, listing and buyer side, and I send him this form and it's got on here that the date financing contingency ends is December 31st, and he thinks it's December 28th, what's going to happen when he gets this form?
He's gonna call you.
He's going to call me and say, you know, I think that's wrong. I think it's supposed to be the 28th. At least I hope he does. Now, two things can happen. One of us is wrong. Right? He thinks the 28th, I think the 30th, and as Mario just pointed out, we could both be wrong. So it's important though, because what this does is it makes sure that everybody involved is all on the same page as far as when dates happen. Because sometimes it's confusing. People get confused. Well, so if binding was today, do I count today as day number 1? Or is tomorrow day number 1? That's my accent.
Don't do that again.
Don't do that. Man, that was my acting career. It truly is. The best way to think about that is if you only had one day of binding, and today was, I mean, if you only had one day of due diligence or any other contingency for that matter, and today was binding, would it end at midnight tonight?
Yes.
No,
Why not?
Tomorrow.
because you need at least a day.
24 hours.
So what if you got a
Oh,
contract
24
at like
hours
10
from the
o'clock at
sun.
night? Then you
Oh.
only have like 2 hours.
Okay.
So it's midnight the next day. Day number 1 is tomorrow.
Yes.
Okay.
And you go from there and there. Okay?
From today.
Correct. 1 day from,
Not on.
not on. Doesn't
Right.
include. All right, any question about this one? This one's pretty straightforward. Because the other information it puts in here, it puts copies to, and you can put in the copies of when this all went to who it went to. Okay? Next one is unilateral to withdraw an offer, and the next one is unilateral notice to purchase. No, sorry. Unilateral notice to terminate purchase sale agreement and proposed disbursement of earnest money. Also known as a TNR, although it doesn't say release anymore, but that's what we called it for 50 years. So it's called TNR. It's very important you know when to use which one of these forms. Because I have seen agents use this unilateral notice to withdraw an offer when they are under contract. And does that work?
No.
No, it does not. This is what you use when you're under contract, right? The notice to terminate. Because you have to terminate if it's under contract. This, however, you use if you put in an offer and your buyer decides, oh, I want to go. They want to go buy something else or whatever. They want to get rid of that offer. Then we withdraw the offer. Okay? This is also very important to use if you're the seller and say, for instance, you just countered an offer that you got. And you've given them 2 days to respond to the counter because you're nice. and another offer comes in. And it's like way better than what you countered those people. Quick, fill this out, send it over. Why?
You can't send the other.
Because as soon as that other buyer signs
Then
the
you gotta
counter
fill this
offer,
one.
I'm done, I'm under contract now. So I need to withdraw it so that I can then accept this one and move on. So this is an important form to know how to get to and what to use. Okay, pretty straightforward. It just says that the buyer's notice to the seller or seller's notice to the buyer that, oh, by the way, we've decided we don't want to do this anymore. We're out. So you cannot accept the offer anymore. Okay? Whereas the notice to terminate has two parts. The top part is the termination part. And it says either the buyer or seller does hereby give notice that we're terminating based on either the buyer's right to terminate during due diligence. You notice it doesn't say seller's right to terminate during due diligence, right? But can the seller, Mark, the seller does hereby give notice that the buyer has the right to terminate during due diligence? Not really. Because then I would be acting on behalf of the buyer, and the buyer needs to do that, okay? You can have the failure of any following contingency, and you explain what that is. Default of the agreement by the buyer or the seller, and you give a little explanation of what that means. Those two are fairly similar from the standpoint of default versus a contingency that failure happened. And then any other lawful reason. I always love when people mark D and other lawful reason and write stuff in. Because usually it's made up. Just my experience. Because if it's not due diligence, another contingency, or default, well, how else are you getting out of the contract? Now, I'm sure there are reasons that are valid, which is why that's on there, but for the most part, it's going to be one of the first three.
Isn't that D also sort of skating along the line of practicing law by saying this is a lawful reason?
It could be. We always kind of push that limit a little bit. And maybe we were directed by an attorney that this is the reason that you're canceling the contract. And yes, if you were directed by an attorney that way, you would want them to email that to you as opposed to just telling you over the phone.
Or you can always send them an email, this is what I heard you say.
Correct.
I have a question about death. Okay, let's say the seller
Death.
dies, and you're past due diligence.
Is that a lawful reason for getting out? Okay, so side note, because I saw a commercial last night. It was a commercial for some drug. If you've taken some drug, that you could be involved in some suit, against the drug company. And it said, if you have been injured, something, or died, please call. If you get a call from somebody that died, I'm a little concerned. But anyway, yes, if you die, is that a valid reason to get out of the contract?
No.
Nope. Your estate's still on the hook.
Okay.
But then
Now-
the contract would get delayed until the probate issues are sorted through.
Definitely. And so in all reality, there's probably a mutual termination that would agree to happen. Okay.
Or the buyer could then say, because of the seller's failure to close the deal within a period of time, therefore I'm canceling this contract.
Correct.
So if the buyer dies, you still have to go through the contract? I knew if the seller died. you
Yep.
still-
The contract does not allow for you to die. You're not.
Unless there's a financing.
Yeah, I was gonna say, if there's, can't get a loan for.
But if that's already
Technically,
if you've already gotten approved through the
I mean, that's the thing, is how far down the path are you? Technically, you can't sign the closing documents either because you're not alive. I mean, in all reality, the contract, yes, does not allow for you to die, but, most of the time, people are reasonable and
So
allow people to
let's
walk
say you lost your job, you've already done due diligence, you've already gotten up financing agreed and all that. You're on the hook.
Yeah.
Even though you've lost your job at the
Doesn't
9th
matter.
hour.
If you lost your job the morning of closing,
Okay.
you're screwed.
Yes, you are.
That's a technical
Unless you
term.
mutually agree.
Unless you call and you do the pity thing,
Please,
please.
don't. Please give me my earnest money back.
Yeah.
Because it is literally the last money I have.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, that's really sad.
Because it might be in that situation. So yeah, you definitely.
You should be fine.
The other thing that's important in this is
Disbursement of earnest money.
this says or, this says and. So only one party has to sign the termination notice, but both parties have to sign the release of earnest money. Okay, or the proposed disbursement of earnest money. It's also important that you say, if you read this sentence, please make it actually be a sentence. The party unilaterally terminating this agreement proposes that the earnest money and any other funds currently being held by holder be dispersed as follows. Brett Duffy. Not a good answer. What does that mean?
Brent Duffy is to receive 100%.
I mean,
of the earnest.
You need to say how much and who gets it.
And you can, if you really want to go crazy, you can even specify
In what
manner
form.
of
Yep.
delivery.
But don't do that.
And if the seller doesn't want to sign it?
Yes, what do you do?
And so then remember, as we went back to in the original contract, if the seller doesn't sign this, or the buyer doesn't sign it because the seller got to terminate, then the holder of the earnest money has to make a determination, interpretation of the contract. Now, what's interesting, if you remember our conversation, if I'm a brokerage, which I kind of am, then I get to make that interpretation. And I do a 10-day letter, and there's a whole process outlined in the contract of how that process works. If I happen to be a closing attorney that is holding the earnest money,
You're a schnook.
I'm pretty much going to say, sorry, you guys can't work it out. It's going to go to interpleader, which means going to court. Which means if you have anything other than maybe $50,000 to $100,000 in earnest money, nobody's getting anything but the attorneys. Okay, and I don't mean the closing attorney is going to get it. I mean that, you know, the people that are arguing are going to end up eating it up in costs. And I mean, what's funny is a lot of times a $10,000 earnest money check will initiate or instigate, in this case, lots of creative interpretations by either party that's trying to get the money. And they'll push it and they'll want to go, oh, I'm going to court. Okay, you understand. You're really not going to get much of that by the time, you know, we're going to burn all this up. Whatever. You know, it'd be so much better if we could just agree to do something other than just going to court. And so for most cases, we try to go to mediation, or we try to just get them to work it out and do an agreement.
I'm a big fan of mediation.
You are, yes.
But I was also going to suggest that, well, I'm going to back off. I'll go like that. Never mind.
Okay. It is always in everyone's best interest to try to be cooperative. Because if you do end up in court, somebody's going to lose. And more than likely, both people are going to lose.
You just need to keep everybody alive.
And keeping people alive is important. And I mean, we've had situations, not to try and be glib, but we've had situations where the seller became non-capable of signing anymore. They weren't dead, but they weren't legally competent. And so that creates a hole,
Sure.
you know. And so, you know, you got to be able to deal with the situations. And that's part of the reason why it's great to have people around you that have experience and have the ability to support you through those. Because if you're fresh into it and you end up in a situation like that, you have no idea what to do. And you could really mess up the representation of your client previously. So you just gotta be careful with that. All right, that concludes our extensive look at the contracts and the exhibits most commonly used. Not quite all of them, but most of them.
Did we do the last amendment to reduce the?
We did that
Okay.
originally with the finance contingency. Remember? I
Oh, that's
jumped
right,
around.
that's right.
Any questions about contract in general, thoughts? Shall we do a summary session or shall we move on to another topic? Just as a question.
Depends on what the other topic is.
I like round numbers, and so we are at session number 9 on the contract, and so we could do one more just to have 10, but no.
Think of it as a triple trilogy.
Triple trilogy, there we go. It's like Star Wars.
Are we meeting next week?
Next week
Christmas?
is
Christmas week.
23rd. I don't think so. No. No.
What about the 30th?
No.
No.
We won't meet until the next year.
January?
So, I mean, we did all right this year. We had 29 weeks out of 52, so it's not bad.
We're
That's
over
pretty
500.
good. That's better than where we could have been. So I think we did pretty well, and so we'll continue on into next year with some more of them.
So can we provide you with suggestions for what we'd like to hear?
Sure. I'm always open to suggestions. You know me. We will go back sometimes, and more than likely when we do the first session next year, we'll do a review of kind of what we have done, because we do that every so often just to make sure that we are all aware of what we've covered, and make sure that we're still moving on the things that we're supposed to be moving on. But then we'll move on to, because I think we've done a lot of seller coverage, a lot of listing related things. We've done listing presentation, we've done prospecting, we've done all of that, contracts now. We've done some negotiation stuff when we did the contracts, but we'll probably do some more on negotiating itself, just kind of practices, and continue forward with being able to close the deal, really nail down different property types and things like that. We'll do some specialty stuff. So, any other questions or thoughts? All right. Thank you guys very much. I enjoyed everybody being here, and we will hit it again in a couple of weeks.
Thank you.